Hello and welcome to the 3D Blu-ray Bunker. This is a place for us die-hard fans of 3D where we look exclusively at 3D Blu-rays, not to review the film itself, but to have a close-up look at the film's 3D with some thoughts about how well it works. And today we're looking at the final Star Wars saga film, and what I strongly suspect will be the last ever Star Wars film to get a 3D release, The Rise of Skywalker. And like all of them, this is post-converted 3D, not natively filmed. I think it's generally accepted amongst Star Wars fans that the best 3D was in The Force Awakens and the worst 3D in Solo, with the other three sitting sort of somewhere on the scale in between them. From my point of view, up to the release of this disc at least, that scale of quality saw Force Awakens very significantly at one end, and the others all grouped relatively closely together at the other end. So where does Rise of Skywalker fit in? I've recently watched all five on the same system at home, which I think allows for a better comparison than seeing them at various different cinemas over a period of 4 years. So I think Rise of Skywalker does a few 3D things quite well, but because it had the same director, I can't help drawing plenty of comparisons to The Force Awakens, and unfortunately, I think these are never in The Rise of Skywalker's favour. Something that the first film did a lot of was show loads of depth in a lot of those Star Wars spaceship corridors, and that's something that this film really doesn't do. We either very rarely get these views down the corridors, or when we do, there's often a very shallow depth of field in the focus this time around, so the shot's just not so impressive. There's one quite nice camera move along the length of one corridor, so there's some feeling of 3D movement here, but I think it was done much better in the first film. Another comparison is when the action is set amongst trees. There were some very good 3D moments within the trees in Force Awakens, but the 3D in this short scene is much weaker and less effective. Abrams even never does the obvious shot in this film with a lightsaber like he did first time around. So here, for example, you've got Kylo Ren's arm popping out of the screen, but this scene doesn't let the lightsaber do the same, which is maybe odd. And it stays behind the screen here too, with those blobs on the camera lens being placed at about the screen level. Even during the fights or Rey's training, they're never really placed in exciting 3D space, and the framing always looks a bit wrong for 3D, with them breaking out of the boundary of the frame most of the time. Maybe the most surprising moment from missed lightsaber opportunity is this kill, which to my mind could have been a really fun piece of 3D if it had been much closer up, but as it is, there's nothing really of any interest from a 3D point of view in this shot. There's a shot he used a few times in the other film of ships coming from behind the camera and flying into the screen, which we get once or twice here, and it's quite effective, again with the 3D giving them that feeling of flying overhead. Something this film seems to do much more than Force Awakens is use a lot of very quick editing, more like the other Disney Star Wars films, and this is something that I think is almost always detrimental to good 3D. So shots like the ships flying through this place ought to look great in 3D, but these are split-second shots, so there's really no time for the 3D to work well. And it's the same sort of thing, even worse really, flying through this red space cloud. Again, there's scope for this looking great in 3D, but it's super fast movement here in a very brief shot, so that's just not good, unfortunately. There's a tiny bit of slow motion, which I think is almost always very beneficial to good 3D, so this attack on the ship here looks pretty good because you get a good chance to appreciate the solidity of it, even if the 3D isn't all that strong. Brief moments of 3D can, I think, work well under certain circumstances, like when they come as an intentional jolt rather than being just quick edits within a scene. So this moment during Poe's lightspeed skipping sequence is quite effective as we suddenly cut to these rock cones. This sequence could have had much more fun with 3D though, as he skips from place to place, because the next location they immediately jump to has these structures that could look good in 3D, but we don't get that view of them, so the only thing in 3D space here is the Millennium Falcon's cockpit. And then the third place he jumps to has very little 3D fun. It actually looks like he's arrived on Arrakis, presumably as a nod to George Lucas having pinched the desert setting from Dune for Tatooine way back when. Another brief moment that works quite well is when Kylo's ship pops out of empty space, which is quite a nice move into negative parallax for fans of pop-out. And the film does have quite a few pop-outs, from the very standard gunshot. I think all of the Star Wars 3D films, along with pretty much every other 3D film featuring guns, had a few shots like this, and these are all fine. Or more impressive than these is a nice view of the Millennium Falcon's guns popping away out of the screen, even if this is another one of those sub 1 second shots that I think is much too quick to satisfy. And Star Wars being Star Wars, there have to be characters reaching out, so Rey does that here, with her arm coming out of the screen, although the camera move here goes on to cut her hand out of the frame as it moves in closer, so it's not exactly top drawer 3D framing. And Kylo Ren has another reach out moment too, and this one is kind kind of interesting, because in Force Awakens I think he reached out with his right hand, but here he's doing it with his left hand. I say interesting, and I know it doesn't sound like the correct description at all, but I do quite like the way that it's basically a mirror of the shot in Force Awakens, and more so because there's another mirrored pop-out shot. If you've seen Force Awakens, you'll remember the awesome shot of a Star Destroyer, the film's absolute standout piece of wild 3D. Well, this film's most blatant piece of 3D is almost a mirror image of that shot. I don't think it's quite as good here as the ship moves towards the camera and out of the frame. It's still pretty excellent though. But then as we move down to the significant thing, which is the big gun underneath, that gun remains in positive parallax, which is a bit of a shame. Although on the plus side, we do then cut back to it, this time close up and poking a good way out of the screen. There's a sequence set in a snowy place where the snow flurries around to varying degrees of 3D success. Sometimes it looks quite good, other times maybe not so much, and here it actually looks like some of the snow is in the same 3D space as Poe's head. The film does feature a few shots where things stretch deep into the screen. So for example, there's this massive chain-like structure which looks like it goes a long way back into the frame, or this top-down view on a gigantic wall is pretty nice too, and there's a similar top-down view sailing towards and into this huge structure, and there's a classic view down on someone in a dangerously high up position which works well, and there's a nice bit with old Lightning Fingers doing his party trick in good 3D space, and it's a scene that works well from a couple of different views, so that was decent of him to help the 3D along. And I think these strong 3D views, along with that Star Destroyer and a nice shot of some space rocks drifting around the screen and towards us, are amongst the film's best uses of 3D, although they don't really add up to more than about 60 seconds of the film's 2-hour plus running time. As far as more subtle uses of 3D go, I really only noticed one that I liked a lot, and it's this view down on the hangar floor, where you can quite clearly see the depth in the reflection of the hangar's ceiling. It's one of those moments where it feels like the conversion went the extra mile to do something impressive and interesting, when they could just as easily have not bothered and no one would have particularly noticed. And maybe they did that by way of apologising for some of their less impressive work, because this film does have quite a few conversion errors. There's an, at first, great shot where the camera moves through large leaves towards Rey, and those big leaves are moved through 3D space really well. But the tree branches and leaves to the left and right of the frame are ripped apart by bad conversion. And this isn't really nitpicking, as errors like this do tend to jump out of the screen. Also, it's a real shame that nothing interesting is done with the rocks she's levitating. You'd have hoped that maybe several of them could have emerged from the screen. There are a few other problems with the foliage, like here it pulls part of the Millennium Falcon's structure into the same 3D space as the grass. And I always think if you're going to shoot scenes amongst dense foliage in a film that's going to have a post-converted 3D treatment, wouldn't it make sense to hire in a 3D camera rig just for a few days to get those shots? I'm sure that the accountants have good reasons for not doing that, but it's a shame as these shots end up just looking nasty. There are a few other similar problems, like the smoke here pulling the rock face into the same 3D space as the smoke, or maybe the most egregious conversion error is a shot where Finn and Poe walk down a hill and the field is warped into a very strange space. It just does look all a bit shoddy. In fairness, there is one view with some thistles or something like that where they're placed quite nicely in the foreground, which gives a pleasing three-dimensional framing to the shot. Some of the framing does suit 3D very nicely, and the view looking up at this chap is a good example of it working well with quite a bit of depth, but there are several other nicely framed shots where the 3D doesn't work as well as I'd expect it to, and this is really my overall complaint about the film's 3D, which is that for the most part there isn't a great deal of depth, and what little depth there is doesn't feature much in the way of strong separation in between the elements within it to create a feeling of volume. So for example, crowd shots like this in other films often have a much better sense of space between every character, but here it's just not really very impressive, with only a small amount of 3D space separating everyone. There are just so many moments where it felt like the 3D could and should have been much stronger, like looking down on Rey as she crosses this little canyon. This isn't shot particularly well for 3D, and the edge of the cliff here looks almost like the conversion guys cut it out with a pair of scissors. It's odd. The blue tunnel of light during the hyperspace jump is pretty two-dimensional, again, when it seems an obvious enough thing to make it a three-dimensional tunnel. And there's a view down on this little boat crossing some dangerous waters where the 3D could have been used to dramatically heighten the wave, but there's just not much effect here. And long shots are also pretty devoid of anything in the way of 3D, so there's no fun hyperstereo views. So like all these Star Destroyers could look great in 3D, but they've opted for the realistic view, like realism is such a big thing in these films. Then there's stuff like this, bits and pieces pouring off this ship. Look like they've been done in quite a half-hearted way. It certainly doesn't look as solid as it could, which all suggests to me that they didn't do much in the way of rendering CG elements into native 3D, but instead they just ran them through the conversion process along with everything else. This view of a thing that I think is called a holocron is very solid, and for a moment it looks like we can see something in 3D space inside it, which would have been really nice, but that red dot turns out to be just a view of a ship that we're fading into here. Spaceships are placed in front of backgrounds with some space in between them, but there's never anything excitingly three-dimensional about the backgrounds, so flat planets or whatever else the background is. The view in the distance is never any kind of 3D treat, and sometimes when the entire shot is in the distance, then it appears almost as good as flat. Another odd thing here is that, this being J.J. Abrams, there's plenty of lens flare, but unusually it's never put into interesting 3D space. They normally pull this strongly into the foreground, but here it just sits boringly somewhere on top of whatever's closest to the camera. Also, I love it when strong 3D is used at dramatic moments in films. That's just a really good use of the process to help the story. So how's this for a good 3D shot during one of the film's most dramatic moments? Basically, it's completely hopeless. And worst of all, from a weak 3D point of view, I think, is this scene with thousands of ships that could have been an incredible moment of powerful 3D, but it ends up having very little depth or three-dimensional drama. Judging by the look of a lot of the 3D compositions in this film, it looks to me like this wonky-eyed character could have been the stereographer. In fairness to this old boy, I think he was probably busy conducting his business elsewhere with a different kind of composition. On the whole then, I think as a 3D presentation, this film is a bit of a disappointment, and I'd lump its 3D quality in with the other Star Wars films after Force Awakens. Not quite as useless as Solo's, but about on a par with Rogue One and Episode 8, which is to say, a long way from being demo material. So, just a very quick word about the film itself. I suspect books are going to be written about how these three sequels are the perfect example of how not to make a trilogy of films, with no clear plan from the start, or certainly none that was followed, and directors playing tug-of-war with each other's ideas. So this film had to pick up what pieces were left after Episode 8 had disregarded most of what was set up in The Force Awakens, and it left the Star Wars machine pretty much out of gas. So I was genuinely amazed that so many people found this film to be such a disappointment. I'm really not sure what they had been expecting. So it's fueled by MacGuffins, coincidence, crazy twists, and more domestic revelations, plus it had to work around the tragic death of Carrie Fisher, which I actually thought it did an okay job of. In fact, if you could find someone who's never seen a Star Wars film and didn't know who Carrie Fisher was, and if you could then get them to sit through this thing and tell them that one of the characters had been digitally inserted with a performance that was made up of and written around old outtakes from a previous film, while most people probably would spot that it was Princess Leia, I do think that a fair few might suggest Rose Tico too, who has a very strange place in this film. So it's a load of old cobblers that maybe doesn't stand up to a moment's scrutiny of its plot, but in spite of all that, I really enjoyed it. What I think it did very well was the interplay between the three young leads, and something that Episode 8 inexplicably decided to totally jettison after it had been set up in Force Awakens. And there were several emotional moments that I was happy to buy into, like Chewie howling in grief and the return of more than one character from previous films, and an epilogue that I loved even if most people seemed to scoff at it. Anyway, I thought it was a more triumphant ending than I'd expected after Episode 8. But that's the end for the saga, and like I said at the top, I've got a bad feeling that it's the end for 3D Star Wars too, so for me it's a shame that the 3D here wasn't a bit more impressive, although on balance I'd still rather watch this in 3D than in 2D. So I hope you found this in some way useful, and if so, I hope you'll join me again soon for another 3D Blu-ray review. Until then, thanks for looking in on this one, cheers for now, bye bye.